Right, so welcome to Stanford University, and we are with Professor Dirzo. Professor, thank you for your time today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Could you briefly take us through what you do at Stanford University, please?
Yes, at Stanford University, as is the case of any professor here, I spend my life doing essentially two things. One of them is to do research. The idea there is to produce novel knowledge, new scientific knowledge for the world. And the other thing that I do, which is what everybody does here, is to teach as well. Beyond that, there's a number of additional activities that you can do. I do a lot of outreach activities in communities, not only in the Bay Area, but also in communities adjacent to the field sites where I do my research, mostly in tropical countries, both in Latin America and also a little bit in Africa as well.
Okay.
In addition to my work as a researcher and as an instructor, teacher, I also do some administrative activities. In particular, I am the director of the Center for Latin American Studies, one of the interdisciplinary centers of the university, and in this particular case, I am in charge of the area, Latin America, and I am the director of that entity as well.
So when we first met the other month, Professor, you mentioned the word defaunation.
Yes.
At the time, it was a word I'd never heard of, but I find it's fascinating, the story behind it. It's a word you've actually created.
Okay.
Could you take us briefly through how you came up with the word and why?
Right. Okay. So this word is, the idea of this word is actually to have a similar term to the term we use when we talk about the loss or destruction of the flora. In this case, we want to talk about the loss and destruction of the animals, of the fauna. So deforestation is a word that everybody understands. It's an easy word to catch, and it's such a well-known phenomenon that everybody understands what we mean when we say deforestation. But unfortunately, we have a situation in many ecosystems, particularly in tropical ecosystems, whereby the animal populations are being heavily impacted by a number of human activities, anthropogenic impact. And so I wanted to have a word that would convey the same urgency and emergency of the situation, which is the degradation and loss and potentially local and global extinction of animals in relation to the word fauna. So I use the word defaunation to actually try and convey that just as we know about this incredible phenomenon of deforestation, there is an equivalent process of defaunation, of the losing of the animals, particularly the medium and large animals of natural ecosystems. And in some sense, this is critical, in my opinion, because we really need to be aware of the situation, because in contrast to what we see in the case of deforestation, for example, we can see satellite images of different times of a given location, and you can see the changes in forest coverage, and that will actually allow you to measure the rate of loss of the flora, and so we can have rates of deforestation. But because we cannot really see animals via satellite images, we tend to miss this critical phenomenon going on, which is the loss of the animals. So I would say, in some sense, this is a cryptic human impact that we don't really get to see because technically it's very difficult. That's why I wanted to convey the notion that this is a very serious process that is going on, and hence my attempt to popularize or to make people aware globally that we have this problem, which is the loss of the animals, and hence the word defaunation.
Okay, so I was reading some literature where you make the connection between the herbivores and the carnivores.
Yes.
And the loss of one can impact the other. So
right.
Could you take us through an example of how that would...
Yes. So we have this very interesting situation, which is sort of the ecological relationships between plants and animals, and even microorganisms at different levels. But we tend to think that, for example, extinction or decline in populations is a phenomenon that will affect that particular population that we are targeting our interest in. Let's suppose the case, a simple case that will illustrate the problem, I think, of a particular plant species. Let's suppose a plant species which, because of overexploitation or habitat destruction, is driven to local extinction. So that would be a pity, because that plant is going to be lost. But the plant might have one or several species of pollinators, animals that will use the plant for the acquisition of nectar, and then the plant will need those animals for the pollen to be transmitted to other plants and for the plant to be able to reproduce. That would be the pollination of the plant. So let's suppose that that plant species goes extinct locally, then the animals that depend on that plant will also go extinct. So that would be a phenomenon in which an impact on one particular species will have repercussions or cascading effects, that's what we call it, onto other organisms in the community, in the food of web locally, and also on the processes. In the particular case of defaunation, the kinds of things that we have discovered are a little bit unexpected. Let's imagine a tropical rainforest ecosystem, say in the Amazon, in Latin America. Human impact is having a tremendous and negative impact on animals such as the tapirs, the peccaries, the deer, sort of the medium-sized and large-sized animals of a rainforest. If those animals are not present, you will not notice that in the satellite images, but if you're an ecologist and want to look at ecological relationships, then you will notice, by doing some research, you will be able to find out that in the absence of those animals, the large seeds of the plants of the rainforest are not going to be eaten, because the predators of those seeds would have been the tapirs, the peccaries, the deer. Those seeds, without the predators, they will germinate and will produce the baby plants. If you don't have the deer and peccaries and tapirs, then those plants are not going to be grazed upon by any animals. What that means is that those plants are going to be out of control, they will not have their natural control, and those plants will outcompete some other plant species. And eventually you can consequence in terms of reducing the ecological forest. Shrubs and grasses are going to proliferate in the absence of the elephants and giraffes and zebras. Sort of a natural, obvious thing to happen. And we've measured that with great precision, but we've discovered that in addition to that, what happens is because of this proliferation of plants in the understory, shrubs, grasses and so on, and many seeds that are sort of remaining there, that brings up as a consequence that the populations of small mammals, particularly rodents, are increasing in numbers. And that's kind of a natural thing when you think about it. You see, you don't have the big animals, then the vegetation grows in exuberant ways, and then you have more habitat and more seeds and more refuge for the little rodents. And then rodents are increasing in abundance. And this leads me to another interesting term that I'm trying to come up with, and I'm trying to popularize, which is rodentation, the increase in rodents, as a consequence of the defaunation of the big animals. So there's another connection here. The point is that if you have increases in the abundance of populations of small mammals, some of them rodents, the situation is that many of them do carry ectoparasites, fleas and ticks and things like that, and those ectoparasites in turn, they carry a number of pathogens, microorganisms that bring up diseases. And our research in Kenya is finding, with the cooperation of the Centers for Disease Control in the US, that in a situation where you have rodentation, an increase in rodents, you are likely to have many more pathogens associated to that proliferation of rodents. Turns out that those pathogens, some of them are relevant for human health. Bartonella, Leptospiras, even plague, are present in those samples that we're analyzing in our research. And sort of the interesting and vicious circle connection here is that the areas where the most intense defaunation is happening is where human densities are very high. And if that is leading to an increase in risk of disease, of course, having high human densities is the best place, so to speak, for the proliferation of diseases to occur. Right? So this is kind of a vicious circle that we've discovered as a consequence of being studying the phenomenon of human impact on the animals, defaunation. You see the connections. I mean, this is you know, some that seem to be very simple, very innocent, right? Just killing animals can have consequences in the diversity of the forest as a whole, or even in human health.
It's certainly, from what we're hearing, it's a huge problem with such a wide impact.
Oh yeah, oh yeah, yeah.
It's incredible. So can I ask you, Professor, what's been the impact from the scientific and research community to your work?
So this is an interesting question. The thing that one has to bear in mind in relation to this is that this is a relatively new field of research. I mean, you know, in some sense we are aware of the fact that deforestation is happening, as they say in the U.S., big time around the world. But the situation of the animals is not so easy to measure, because you don't have satellite images that can tell you the rates of change in the populations of animals. So unless you do things like what we do, initially we started by doing really very simple things, such as, for example, going to the forest floor in these tropical ecosystems and find fine sand and place it on the ground in specifically located positions, so that the animals will tell us if they are there or not by looking at the footprints, right? But you can imagine how tedious and time-consuming that kind of a protocol is. The other thing that we have done for many, many years actually is to go very early in the morning with our binoculars and do sort of a transect surveys, just walking through the forest and hoping for you to be able to detect the presence or absence of animals. And we do that in the early morning and also in the evening or at night. But of course that's really very tricky. The situation got better when the infrared cameras, the trap cameras, came into place and they became available. So we had more ideas as to what is the situation of the animals. And now the combination of all of those techniques and tools is helping us to understand the magnitude of those problems. Let me introduce a brief parenthesis here. For example, a study, an amazing study done in the Brazilian Amazon by a Brazilian scientist working in a British university, Carlos Perez. He has come up with the estimate that just in the Brazilian Amazon, the rate of defaunation per year is about 14 million animals. 14 million animals being lost on a yearly basis, just in the Brazilian part of the Amazon. That's the mammals. That's just considering the mammals. If you want to look at all the vertebrates, right, mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles, the number he estimates is about 23.5 million animals per year. So really it's a very dramatic process. It is almost impossible not to think that would have ecological consequences. And that's where we come in, right? Studying the ecological significance of all of those things. But as I said, this is a relatively new field that had not been explored in the past in terms of the ecological consequences. So I think the impact in the scientific community and ideally in the public in general is going to be considerable, but that is taking time, in part because this research and this sort of way of approaching the ecological connections is relatively new. I must mention that recently my colleague Mauro Galetti from Sao Paulo and myself just edited a special volume of the journal Biological Conservation, which is completely dedicated to defaunation, and there we're beginning to address this problem in a more comprehensive way. I am glad to report that now we have scientists working on this topic in Southeast Asia, in Africa, and of course in Latin America. So gradually, the sort of the understanding of this phenomenon, of this thing that I would call a new global environmental change, is sort of percolating through the understanding of scientists and ideally through the understanding of the public. So what we're doing in terms of having this conversation is actually a wonderful thing in terms of sort of conveying or sharing this information with the general public.
Yeah, very important indeed.
Yeah.
So what are the kind of things that you think the public can do to assist in this situation? Is there anything that people in the West can do?
Well, there is a number of things. So the main drivers of defaunation are, on the one hand, as people can easily imagine, hunting and poaching. Illegal trading is a major issue. It is estimated that the illegal trading with wildlife is perhaps the second largest illegal activity after drug trafficking. And so really this is a massive problem. So one thing that we can do globally is to make sure that we don't buy products that come without any certification from, ivory from elephants in Africa or Southeast Asia, skins, pelts. I mean, we cannot do that. And just a little bit connecting to the kinds of things that you do with, with the certification of trees and with the tracking and correct identification of trees which are legally obtained, those kinds of things should be applicable also in the case of animals. So trying to do anything that would prevent or that would encourage the purchasing of animal or animal parts, that would be an important thing for us to do globally. That's one thing. The other thing that we need to do is, I think, to do precisely this thing, which is sharing with the public what are the consequences of what is at stake if we don't pay attention to the situation of the forest and the animals of the forest. We've talked about disease being an issue, but it's also important for people to consider this is a very ethical problem as well. What is our responsibility as members of this generation in not leaving a better future for our kids and grandkids and so on? How sad will it be if we don't have a solution to the point that our kids or grandkids will not have an opportunity to ever see an elephant or ever know that elephants were an important component of the life of this planet. After all, what we see in life today is the product of 3.5 billion years of evolution, and then having one species, Homo sapiens, sort of having a tremendous impact on this incredible biodiversity, this incredible product of evolution, is a very sad, and it's a very profound ethical responsibility that we need to pay attention to. Beyond that, I think that education is an important component of addressing these issues. I think education is kind of the best ways of looking into the future, particularly for the younger generations, for all of these things that we are trying to do collectively, the kinds of things that you do with your trees, the kinds of things that I do with my research, are going to be important to the extent that society understands these issues and is sort of holds hands with us in terms of accompanying us in addressing these issues. The global environmental problems that we're facing now are not only important in terms of the ecology, they're important in terms of society and the human well-being looking into the future.
So, Professor, what is your ultimate goal that you want to achieve with your research around defaunation?
Okay, so there's a number of things. Of course, there is the sort of the innate motivation of a scientist, like in my case, to understand how life works. Unfortunately, the situation of human impact is, in some sense, allowing us to understand the significance of all of these ecological connections. So, for me to illustrate and share with the world what is happening with our human impact, with our impact on natural ecosystems, that's one of my main goals. Another thing, obviously, is that I want to train students to sort of to be the next generation of scientists and policymakers who will be paying attention to these situations. But then in a more practical sense, given the situation that we have discovered in terms of deforestation on the one hand and defaunation on the other hand, we want to do activities that will address those issues directly. In the case of deforestation, we have a long tradition of doing reforestation programs, restoration programs. In the case of the animals, one of my goals is to think about the future in terms of being able to restore the animal conditions or the animal population conditions of many ecosystems. That would be kind of the opposite of defaunation. That would be refaunation, to bring back the animals. And as you can imagine, this is not a simple thing. So the first requisite for us to be able to do that is to have the habitat, the place where the animals could be brought back into. And there your work is really very important. How do we do to manage and sustainably maintain good pieces of forest in the landscape where people can be using forests, but at the same time maintaining some remnants of forest in good condition? Well, those are the kinds of remnants that we will need for us to be able to bring the animals back to those ecosystems. So that's one thing. In more technical terms, there are a number of complications that have to do with things such as, for example, if we want to bring the animals back to a given location, where do we get them from? In terms of the genetic differentiation, it's not the same to bring, jaguars from one locality and to bring them back to an area that has been defaunated in another locality. The genetic makeup of the populations might not be the same as where the place where we want to restore the animal population. So that's another technical problem, sort of the genetics of that. Then the third obviously has to do with disease. In many cases, if we want to bring animals back to a given location, we want to make sure, absolutely sure, that the animals will not bring any diseases that might transmit to other animals in those places that we want to protect or restore. And then third, but not for it being the third is the least important. Actually, it's very, very important that any activities that we do in terms of reforestation or in terms of refaunation, so in terms of fixing the natural ecosystems, is to bring the local communities on board. My experience in doing research in the tropics throughout the world, is that all of these programs and activities will not succeed if you don't get the local community engaged. And I think that's a really critical issue, critical thing that I would love, to not only to have as a goal, but to be able to see before my generation goes away. So really having sort of a more conserved world with significant pieces of biodiversity still remaining for us and for the future generations. That would be my goal, but the specific mechanisms in which I'd love to be able to see that happening is via those activities that I just mentioned.
Okay. So just finally, Professor, when you consider deforestation, you take away the ability of animals to move through the canopy. Does that create a problem where animals end up isolated, not being able to move freely?
Absolutely. So this has to do with a phenomenon that we call fragmentation. You have little pieces of forest immersed in a matrix of transformed habitat. What we want to do, and this is a really critical issue now, to be able to establish connecting corridors across remnants of forest. And of course that's critical for many animals. So many animals will use the forest per se to walk through an area to another area. But for many animals, arboreal animals, monkeys and many birds and so on, they will definitely use the canopy for them to move through areas. So one interesting restoration activity or one interesting conservation activity is to be able to maintain connecting corridors. It turns out that in many cases those connecting corridors happen to be along the sides of rivers, or what we call riparian habitats, riparian ecosystems, which of course are really very critical in terms of maintaining water quality and water availability in local communities. So having those well protected with forests on the sides, which could operate as connecting corridors between fragments or remnants of forest, that would be an important activity. And I know that a number of entities, both scientific and NGOs, are trying to do that. And of course, as I said, the critical issue of maintaining at least some significant representative pieces of the natural ecosystems. And for that, we cannot imagine that at this time, at this day and age, to think of natural ecosystems without people being part of them. Many natural ecosystems have had people naturally as part of them. So what we really want to do is sustainable mechanisms, sustainable ways of using the ecosystems, the sustainable use of trees in forestry activities, the sustainable use of animals in sort of wildlife extraction that can be done, the consideration of the landscape as a mosaic of different patches with different values. It is really very important to maintain forest as forest because of the capture of carbon, because of the release of oxygen, because of the prevention of erosion, because of the maintenance of water quality. So a forest as a forest is also a type of land use which is really very important. But I totally understand that another part of the landscape can be used for sustainable forestry, sustainable coffee production, those kinds of things where humans can actually be part of the general landscape with some pieces of forest as they are naturally.
Okay, well, Professor, I was just thinking one last thing. Has defaunation been submitted to a dictionary?
I have not submitted the word defaunation to any dictionary, and I think I know that Wikipedia has an entry for defaunation, but that would be a good thing to do, I imagine, especially given this crisis that we've been talking about, the magnitude of this phenomenon, which is so pervasive, so universal, and of such a magnitude as we talked about. So that would be, I think, a good thing to try and do.
I think definitely, because when I put it in the word processor, it comes up on the computer as an unknown word. So I think you deserve the credit for coming up with the term. And, they should be noted.
Fantastic.
Well, Professor, thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
I'm going to walk away a bit smarter than I came here this morning.
Thank you very much. That's very kind of you.
Thank you, guys.
For more Jungle Bed, please visit junglebear.com.